Hi, Joaquin. How are you doing?
Hi, Sonia. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. But before we start, Joaquin, as you know, we have a very tough question for our audience. So I would like to invite you all to reply to this difficult question on the chat. No, sorry, not on the chat, but on Mentimeter. We have a Mentimeter that Andrea is going to share with you now. So if you will wait for Andrea to do that, and I don't want to reveal the question before time, but Andrea, if you can share. I'll start with the question while Andrea shares the screen. The question is, pay attention, please, and don't say anything. You will need to enter Mentimeter, so you have to go to this URL, menti.com, and then put that code. I will give you some time for that. Put that code. You can do that on your phones while you are watching this. So go to menti.com and then put the code 3. Please don't answer on the chat, and put the code 43822565. And we would like you to answer, how many times does the song Hey Jude say the name Jude? So that's a tough question. And if you're ready, we'd love to hear your answer through Mentimeter. So you can go to your phone, tap menti.com, put that code, and then you will have the space to answer. Okay, so we have some answers already. Oh, just one. Okay, so let's wait for some more people. I won't do it because I know the correct answer, but I'll go to... Okay, so there's more people coming in. I don't know, Andrea, if we can see the average instead of... It's interesting to see how dispersed the answers are. Okay, let's wait for some more people. I'll see it at Menti. Okay, there's more people coming in. Let's wait for them. And you probably are wondering why we are asking this odd question to start, but I can guarantee this is going to have an explanation. Okay, I think we can stop there. But Andrea, is there a way that we can see the average instead of seeing the individual question, the individual answers? Great, that's the average, 43. Oh no, sorry, 43 was the correct answer, not the average. But I don't know if we can see the average. Okay, how did you do? I think many of you underestimated how many times the Beatles could sing the same word over one song. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. I think more people is voting now, but now you have the right answer. Okay, it's hard to see where the average was probably a little bit below 50, so that might be what we were looking for. But Joaquin, do you want to jump in and explain why we thought this little game would be useful for us to think about collaboration?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what we just done essentially is not only a fun trivia question or game that we brought here to this conference, but also it's one of the most renowned experiments that experimental psychologists have been doing for over 100 years to try to understand our collective mind. And by our collective mind, I mean the phenomenon called the wisdom of the crowds. The wisdom of the crowds, which essentially means that together, a crowd of people, as we are here, can be wiser than even the most accurate individual members. Of course, that phenomenon doesn't always happen, and sometimes it happens quite neatly, as we kind of observe in this data, and sometimes it doesn't really happen at all. So again, I mean, if you look at the distribution that we just showed in the screen, you would see that some people would have guessed that Jude only appeared only a couple of times, maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 times in the entire song, whereas other individuals would have guessed that the correct answer was something like 90 or even 80, let's say 85 times, which was I think one of the highest values that we've seen in the data. So imagine we have those two individuals. Those two individuals are very far away from the correct answer. The correct answer was 43. But if you take the average of those two guesses, which were taken independently from each other, someone in one corner of the world said 5, and the other one, someone else in the other corner of the world said 85. If we average those values, then 85 plus 5 is 90. You divide that by 2, and you get 45, which is quite close to the correct value. So, as I said, that doesn't always happen. What we really need for that, what we know from a ton of research in psychology and in mathematics as well, is that what you basically need for that to happen is people underestimating and people overestimating the correct value. So these kind of errors, to cancel out each other, what they need is diversity in their estimates, diversity in their guesses. And
basically what you're saying is that even when we are wrong, if we are many people in the room, then we might get the right result.
Exactly. That's the key effect, that people can be terribly wrong at the individual level, but collectively you could be wise. You could be very wise. And for that to happen, we need diverse opinions, diverse estimates, diverse points of views.
Okay, but what happens, Joaquin, because I guess that probably people in our audience is wondering, okay, it's okay if the answer to a problem is just one number. And I can tell you that on the chat now, some people is discussing whether we should count on Hey Jude, whether we should count the last part when they say na, 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 and that part where many Judes come in. So there's discussion about this anyway. But generally, when we do research in think tanks, we work with much more complex topics, and we cannot get a single answer that's precise like this 43. We don't know which the very simple and correct answer is, and it's not a numeric answer, so we cannot average the answer. So in those cases, would you say that anyway collective wisdom exists?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and let me just tell you about two research papers that we've been working on in the last 5 years or so. So essentially, one of these paper was about studying what happens when people start discussing these ideas in groups. It's not just averaging or aggregating decisions that people make individually, but sometimes in social contexts, as think tanks, people need to reach consensus. They need to discuss, to deliberate with other individuals, and that gets things much more complicated, because we know, as has been said in the introduction, that from the social psychology from the 70s tell you that when you discuss with other individuals, you tend to follow each other, you tend to imitate each other, and that's dangerous because it reduces the diversity of estimates, of guesses. So what we have done in that first study was trying to understand what's the role of deliberation. So we actually work with a real crowd of 10,000 people who were attending a TEDx talk in Argentina. And we asked them to estimate variables such as the ones we just did in this little game. And critically, we divide them in small groups, in groups of 5 people. and ask them, try to reach an agreement, try to negotiate one value that would represent all of your individual guesses, and try to come up with something that is that represents your individual estimates, right? So,
what kind of questions did you ask them?
So the kind of questions were very similar to the ones we just asked here. Was how many goals were scored in the 2010 FIFA World Cup? How tall is the Eiffel Tower in meters? By the way, 324. I know that by working so many times with that question. And similarly, how many times a given word would appear in a popular song in Argentina, and so on and so forth. So all of these questions...
Again, those were numeric answers, but the difference in this experiment was that people were able to discuss among each other about the...
Exactly. It's kind of like the same kind of questions, but with the possibility that people will have to discuss their estimates and reach an agreement. And what we found is that conversations make things better. I mean, it was different to what we would have expected from the social psychology literature from the 70s. We found that deliberation in small groups, when it happens in small groups, makes things extraordinarily better. And we've seen large improvements in performance just by simple deliberations between people who were initially very uncertain about their values. So
you're saying when you say it's much better, it's not before it feels good to discuss with others or it's the right thing to do, but you're saying that the results of those conversations were more accurate in the end.
Exactly. The results of those conversations were much more accurate than initially, right? I mean, and answering your first question, I mean, one limitation that this entire line of research that we discussed so far is that they rely on these problems having a correct answer. Some of these problems, I mean, we may not precisely know how to get the correct answer. We may discuss, should we count the last part of "Hey Jude"? Maybe not, but essentially we would agree earlier or later than there is a correct answer. There is we can agree on which is the correct answer. But in many interesting problems that we face as societies and that think tanks face all the time, there is no universally accepted correct answer. And the deliberation side resides in how we reach agreement on what is correct and what is incorrect, right? And it's not trivial at all that people will be able to do that. I mean, can people agree on things that are, let's say, polarized as many of the matters that we discuss nowadays in politics, but also in kind of like more everyday issues as well. And of course, in that research, we wouldn't be able to differentiate if groups reaching agreements make better decisions or not, because I mean, when it comes to these controversial matters where there is no universally accepted truth, that lack of universally accepted truth is also lacking for us as researchers. But we sought to address that problem by performing a second study, a second experiment. This one was published in Current Biology in 2019, where we asked people to deliberate on polarized moral issues. So one example of a very polarized moral issue is abortion. I mean, the acceptance of abortion. We know in many societies, people are divided into camps, and there is a pro-choice and a pro-life camp, and we feel, or our intuition, at least before these experiments, is that the chances of those camps getting, I mean, together or agreeing on something should be quite scarce, or close to the probability of doing that is close to zero, to reaching an agreement. However, what we observed was exactly the opposite. We found that conversations are much more powerful than what we could expect from our intuitions. And we believe that this has to do with the intuitions that we have from social media and conversations on Twitter and other like social media platforms, where they are not really designed for deliberation. However, when people were organized in small groups, this time we organized them in groups of 3 people. These 3 individuals, when there was someone who was in one extreme and the other one and one of the others was in the other extreme, the probability that such a group would reach consensus was in some cases close to 50%, which again is not always. I mean, it's not true that we always get along and we always can change our minds, but it's remarkably much more likely than what we at least expected from our intuitions before.
And do you have any hypothesis of why that happened? And how, for me, it is difficult to imagine how 2 people that are not in the same camp in such a diverse issue as abortion could reach any agreement. And is there anything, any of this has to do with the 3rd person on that discussion?
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's you asked the key question, and so how did this group could ever reach agreement? And one information that is lacking from our research is we don't have access to the transcript of the conversations, but through mathematical models and statistics that we could look at the distribution of acceptance ratings that these participants would give before the conversation, we can get insights on what's going on. So that's how we found, and this is the key finding of the paper, that in order for people to reach consensus, this 3rd individual, so this 3rd individual means not the one who is on the extremes, the one who's at the center, needs to be symmetrically positioned from the 2 extremes, so not close to any of the 2 camps, but also this person needs to be in the center of this discussion, not just because this person doesn't know about this particular topic. These persons are people who are in the center, but with high confidence. So let me just elaborate a little bit on this. So typically, when we have any kind of like controversial topic, people at the extremes are very confident, and people at the center have less confidence. So there is like kind of like a U-shaped relationship between confidence and the extremeness of our positions. People at the center don't tend to be very confident, but we found that many people, a large proportion of people in the center, actually were more confident than expected. So they had higher confidence than one would expect, given this U-shaped relationship between your acceptance on a given topic, your endorsement of a given policy, and your confidence. And these persons who are at the center of this debate, but who don't see this problem as black or white, but they are grays. We call them high confidence grays. These high confidence grays are, if a group would have one of these individuals, their probability of reaching consensus was significantly higher, was much more higher than chance.
Well, I think that's absolutely relevant for the things we are discussing over the conference here at the Think Tanks conference, because we are trying to figure out how collaboration can help us reach some kind of agreements or consensus that are based on knowledge. And I guess that those confident grays are probably most of the think tanks around the world working on topics, knowing that there are nuances, that things are complex, but at the same and generally not on the extremes, but having difficulties to help people reach that center and reach agreements. So I guess we need more confidence on our research and and insights to try to bring people together into the discussion. Actually, I was thinking also that this role of because you're basically describing the role of a moderator, to someone who can be in the middle moderating the conversation. And I've seen, like lately, I've been thinking that this role seems to be absolutely crucial. And it is, if you look at what's happening with blockchain, I know I'm bringing a completely different theme, but with blockchain and Web3, where communities are coming together to discuss topics on this new decentralized web, it seems that having someone to moderate those conversations and maybe to be those great, confident people you were talking about, it's going to be crucial in the next few years. I mean, at least if finally Web3 and the metaverse and these new kind of communities keep on growing, we will need much more of this kind of moderators and maybe think tanks to do this job that might be absolutely crucial, and as your research suggests. I was going to ask you, because at the same time it seems that people, as you were saying before, our impression for using social media is that people on the extremes seem to be like more, well, in a sense, more confident, or at least they speak louder, or at least that is the perception we might have. How does that affect us? I mean, because you were saying that confidence seems to be an important characteristic of how people can shape the debates. So is being confident on the extremes something that attracts us or shape the conversation in any way?
Yeah, so let me just to answer this question, tell you about a third paper that we just published it in Science.
One thing, Joaquin, maybe before you answer this one, I forgot to tell everyone that we are going to have an open space for questions at the end. So if you have questions, because I'm asking all the questions and I find this fascinating, but I would like to open the microphone to everyone. So if you want to start putting your questions on the chat, I'll make sure that we can include all those questions in the last minutes of this hour. So please do put your questions there, and I'll take them from the chat. Sorry, Joaquin.
I agree. It's a very important clarification. I also want to engage with the participants of this conference. So essentially about your question. Your question was about I previously spoke about the importance of people at the center, of moderators, of people who are not, like, basically don't see a problem as black or white. They see the midpoints of the debate. We believe that these people are able to see kind of arguments from both camps and integrate them. But our day-to-day experience as well seems to be at odds with this, right? We see extremists being more attractive in public discourse and getting a lot of attention as well. And because they tend to be more confident, then that's probably what's going on. So let me tell you a little bit about a third project, a third paper that has just been published a few months ago in Science Advances.
I love that for every question I ask, you have a paper published and with all the evidence to answer to my question. That's magnific. Sorry,
that's a scientist's role. I mean, to be accurate. And so essentially what we found in that paper was that when we tend to discuss with someone, and in this study we were looking at whether people feel attracted to other individuals. So the task was to discuss with other person for 5 minutes and about 5 political issues, and we would ask them as participants to rate how attracted they felt about the other person, how intelligent that person seemed, how likable that person seemed, how even physically attractive that person seemed.
So it was like a Tinder for ideas, something like that.
Kind of like a Tinder for ideas, exactly. So what we observed, and this is basically different to what most of the literature would suggest before, is that, I mean, if you think about it, there's something going on when we discuss about these kind of ideas, where we tend, or there is a phenomenon in psychology where people tend to be attracted to similar others. So there's this concept called homophily, where you basically tend to be attracted to someone else if that person is similar to you. But we found that that's not the end of the story, that people are not only attracted to similar individuals, but they are very attracted.
Before you say the news, the insights that you got from the study, let me just interrupt you there, because for me it is super interesting to see how many of the insights from experimental psychology are directly applicable to communications. And one thing we've seen many times at Sociopúblico, working in the communication side of complex ideas, is that when you use pictures that are similar to the people you want to reach, like the photos you use, you get more traction. Like if you want to reach people at a certain country, then you use photos of people in that country in particular. And that's something that might seem very obvious, but sometimes think tanks tend to show in their photos the people they want to benefit, for instance, even if they are preparing some piece for fundraising. So they are not they are trying to reach funders through showing photos of the beneficiaries. And sometimes you need to just show the photos of the people you want to reach, because they are going to, as you were saying, feel attracted to people that look similar to them. This is something that in marketing is used all the time. But I think in the ideas, in the ideas camp or the knowledge production camp, it's not something that we have in mind all the time. Yeah. So that's interesting.
Exactly, and this is something that and thank you for the link with the communication side. I will ask a little bit more about that in a second. But the thing or the problem would be basically that. That's not the end of the story. So at least our message is that yes, the attraction to similar people is there, but there are some other effects going on above and beyond this attraction to similar individuals. And what we hypothesized and found, like exhaustive evidence in many different independent studies, is that what really attracts attentions are more extreme versions of ourselves. So basically, it's not like we like extremes. We don't like the extreme from the other side. We actually dislike the extreme from the other side. But what we really like, what really increases our interpersonal attraction, is people who are similar to us, but slightly more extreme. It's not just homophily, it's not just the attraction to people who are similar to ourselves, but the attraction to the extremes who are on our camp. And that's something that basically brings kind of like a different tone to the previous research that I discussed before, because the previous papers were more about, well, okay, people, when they deliberate, they make good decisions. When they discuss about moral issues, they can reach agreements. But this one is kind of like in more pessimistic tone. We see that despite people at the center have the key to reach agreement, they are not listened very often. The people who are much more listened are people who are at the extremes, who have very coherent and kind of like a standard ideological views, and they are very confident about it. So that left us wondering, I mean, a lot of things. I mean, but one of the questions that I would like to ask you as well, to basically make this more of a conversation, and it's essentially how, I mean, what would you think that this could be, or do you think it could be a correlate of this in the communication, kind of like using your communication expertise? Could there, I mean, is it true that people who are like confident can bring attention in in communication. I mean, we found evidence in kind of like a more simple, kind of like and laboratory science, or even slightly more naturalistic settings, but not. Do you think that this could be applicable to your field?
I think, yeah, what you're saying is fascinating, because I guess we all know, all the people here sharing this conversation, that at least I think it is very, we know we need to be clear in our statements when we are presenting evidence. But at the same time, the reason I think what you're saying is absolutely important for think tanks is that it's because of something that Steven Pinker, a neurolinguistic, called the curse of knowledge. And that's the fact that it is very hard for us, and I'm sure you know this from your research perspective, it's really hard for us to remember how it was to don't know what we know. So once you know a lot about the topic, and that's something that happens to all the people who's in this room today, they are researchers or they work on a certain topic and they know a lot about the topic, but then you can't, because you know a lot, you start using jargon and using some different ways to condense your knowledge, which are the ways you use to communicate with other experts. And that's useful to communicate with other experts, but it's not that useful to communicate with the rest of the people who don't know as much as you do about your topic. So, and the other thing that happens is that we feel as experts that we need to caution all our assertions, because we know all the research that's been behind our work, all that knowledge we have, make us try to always mention the doubts that might be there, the doubts that other experts might bring to the conversation, and reply to that. So, and in that sense, we present our arguments with less confidence, because we talk about all the nuances that were behind a certain research. We feel that we need to quote all the different evidence that's backing our arguments instead of just saying the argument. We generally present something that's very common in the way that an expert presents his or her arguments, is to say, in the camp I'm going to talk about, there's been opinions, there's been research saying this, and also there's been research saying that. And there are these, and I'm going to present something that is in the middle. And that's like the opposite to being very confident in the way that you were saying before. So the way that academics tend to express their ideas are quite different to a very confident way to express a point of view. And I think that maybe from a communications perspective, maybe bridging that gap is something that we need to start doing more. And that actually, this is what Steven Pinker says, that we need just say what we want to say instead of using all these caveats and evidence and other things that we generally add to the conversation to feel more secure in terms of the discussion with colleagues. But it's different when you want to reach people who don't know as much as you do about a certain topic. And in general, I think that besides this particular issue of the confidence, to me, I said at the beginning that to me, reading through research on experimental psychology and neuroscience has been like going to Disneyland, because even going back to the things that were discussed in the 70s, like all the work from Daniel Kahneman, for instance, the Nobel Prize, because generally all this literature has been read, and actually it's the way that Kahneman wrote about this as a way for us to make us take better decisions. I mean, if you understand how your brain works and how your psychology works, then you might be able to make to have better judgment, to make better decisions. So at the very individual level, all these insights are useful. But when you look at that from a communication perspective and the way we can influence others or reach others or be convincing for others, then there's so much that we can use there, not for ourselves and our decisions, but to understand others and how to get to them with our arguments. That it's, I find that fascinating, and there are plenty of examples, like all the biases that Kahneman has identified are useful for us to communicate and be more successful in our communications. Like, for instance, well, I'm sure you're very familiar with all this, but for our audience, Kahneman distinguishes, he talks very schematically of those, of two different ways of thinking, what he calls system 1 and system 2. The system 1 is like the automatic one, the one we have always on, and it works through familiarity. It works like like an automatic pilot. And the system 2 is the one that's more intellectual. So just to give you a very small example that has to do with communications and these different biases, when you engage your intellectual system only when it's needed, because for us it's very tiring, it's effortful. We don't want to involve our intellectual brain at every point. We only do it when it's absolutely a need. So one thing that happens in communications is that you tend to think that you need to put like all your messages need to be very big, very short, and very clear. For instance, like the main message you're going to put in your website, for instance, the tagline for your project, the title. But what Kahneman showed us is that if you have, and there are many experiments backing this, is once you need to, if you ask people to read something with a very small font and that's long, then people is going to remember much more from that text because they had to involve their intellectual brain, their system 2, and then they're going to remember more about this topic that they have read about. So, and that's of course super counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect giving people very small fonts and something very complex for them to read, and use that as a successful strategy to communicate with them. But that happens. So it's an insight that we have from understanding how the brain works that can apply directly to communications. And there's plenty of that. I mean, it's really like Disneyland for us working on communications. I'm not saying that you now need to start writing all your articles in very small fonts, because first you need to grab the attention of the audience, and that's a different problem, because if not, they are not going to, they won't even start reading. But once you have the attention of the audience, you might use these tricks for them to remember more about what you are saying. And this is just one very simple example. But coming back to your research, Joaquín, and I'm gonna start taking questions from the chat because there are some already, and please keep on putting your questions there. I was going to ask you if you have found any possible applications of your research, like more concrete applications of the things you've been finding in your work.
Yeah, sure. I mean, especially the first two that I mentioned, the one about deliberation, helping people make better decisions when there is a correct answer, and building consensus where there is no universally accepted correct answer. So maybe there is a correct answer, but there are disagreements about whether something is correct or not. So it's kind of in the moral domain. So the most kind of like relevant point of contact with a practical application that I see from this research is what some political scientists have started proposing as innovations for our democratic system, which is deliberative polls. In deliberative polls, I assume that many people in this audience will already know what I'm talking about, but I'll just explain it briefly. Basically, we or organizers of these deliberative polls invite people, a representative sample or representative or random sample, ideally, of the entire population. Small, but at least like with some high degree of representativeness of the population, would be invited for, let's say, a couple of days, a weekend, to deliberate on key aspects that the society would need to decide in order to pass legislation on those matters. So, for instance, in Ireland, the deliberative poll was organized to let Irish people debate about abortion, and those conclusions from people not just voting as in a referendum, but deliberating and reflecting and weighing arguments against each other, and the conclusions of that, the output of that meeting would be given to people, to legislators and to people in the Congress. So that's one example. Of course, this has been widely applied in a large and diverse set of countries, from the United States to Denmark, but also Tanzania, Brazil, and in many different countries, South Korea. So in all of these different countries, the experiences were wonderful, and we believe that our research kind of like informs on how to, or maybe informative on how to design the groups on which people are invited to deliberate, so that they maximize the chances of getting more rational discussions and more or less emotional discussions in these setups. So that's.
Do you think that's something that could be also applied on a smaller scale, like if a think tank wants to organize and structure discussion, such as a deliberative poll, but without all the backing of a national state and something that's more wider? Would it be possible anyway to do something like that?
Definitely, yes. I mean, the methodology is the same, it's constant. Of course, when you don't get a representative sample, you may get bias you may see bias in the results that you observe. But your target is to engage a certain public, a certain target audience, and make and invite them to deliberate. Then definitely, I mean, this is something that think tanks could easily organize.
I noticed that Andrea is here, but yes. I thought it was a full hour. I haven't made all. I have questions from the audience, and
yes, that's what I meant to bring in the questions from the audience and to use my.
I thought you were here to close the session.
No, I was here for the questions, and I wanted to use my as host privileges to ask the first two questions. And then before we head on to...
I was just going to the chat.
Great. So I had one question. I had two, actually, that were very interesting. Thank you very much. This has been really, really interesting. And I see from the audience there's a lot of interesting comments and thoughts, and this will feed us for a while. So I had two comments. So if what attracts us is the extreme of ourselves, then how can we promote the dialogue needed to reach the wisdom of the crowds? That's one of the... And then on the small print, I wonder who were the subjects of the studies there? When were they taken? If it was prior to technology, and who were the subject of the research? So I'm wondering if now, with our new technology use and our shorter attention span and this like shorter thing, would that still apply? Or so when was this taken? And there's also a couple of interesting questions from the audience. I'm not sure if you want to take them all and then just...
Let's answer these two and then we'll take more. At least my attention span is small, so I wouldn't remember the rest. So Joaquín, do you want to start with the
Yeah, sure. So regarding your first question about the extremes and asking extremes to debate and how this can basically promote consensus and building and so on. So essentially, our research what says is very small, kind of like a point, which is if you have two extremes wanting to, or at least kind of like you want these two extremes to sit down and reach consensus. One good strategy is to invite a third person And this third person needs to be a moderator, and this moderator needs to be in the center of the conversation, needs to be symmetrically positioned from these two extremes, and also kind of like be there not because they lack information, but because they see both arguments from both camps, and those setups, people are much more likely to reach consensus. So regarding your second question about what kind of subjects and when kind of like in time we have performed these experiments. So the earliest experiment that we performed was in 2015, so it's kind of like lately, and the experiments that we mostly have done have been performed with participants of TEDx events. So that obviously raises the question of bias in these participants are there because they want to listen to new ideas, and maybe they score higher on openness or intellectual humility or things that basically would be very different in the wider population. But we kind of like address that point by replicating this experiment in different setups in different countries as well. So, for instance, the one I just mentioned was done in Argentina and in Canada. The one about attraction to the extremists have been done in Argentina, in Portugal, and in the US as well. And so we try to basically be very careful. Again, as well, acknowledging the limitations of our own research, that they are not based on representative samples as well. So everything I have just said, you need to take them with a due careful consideration that is as flawed as any experimental psychology that you could read.
And for the small fonts, those are studies like that started before the explosion of the internet. But the key thing there is that, and they have been done with students at the university that participate in a certain study. So the key point here is that these students participating in these experiments, they had the obligation to read through the text. The only difference that this research found is that once they had the obligation, people who had the smaller fonts remember more than people with a larger font. So that's the insight, because if you need to effort yourself more to read, then you're going to remember more. But you still have the question on how you're going to grab the attention of your audience, because you cannot just bring all the people you want to into an experiment and say they must read something. So for that, I think what is useful from Kahneman is to read all the research he quotes on how to engage the system one, the system that we have always on, the system we use to navigate the world every day. And to give you a very small example of how we can do that, surprise is a key. If we can like deflect the expectations of the people and surprise them slightly, then they are going to pay attention. And then you can introduce a small font, but then first you need to grab the attention. And surprise it's a great key in communications to grab the attention that is backed by experimental psychology. Like for instance, if I would start singing Hey Jude, and if I say, hey Jude, don't make me fun, if I start thinking, you will know, like, because you know the lyrics, once I start, you will disconnect because you know how the song goes on. I say, hey Jude, and you don't need to pay attention to me because you know what's coming. But if I introduce an odd word there, don't make me fun, then you will pay attention because I'm like, in a way, contradicting your expectations. So that kind of surprise that we can introduce, for instance, in a title, in the way we present on a TED Talk or any opportunity for communications, that's the key to attract the audience's attention, and then we can introduce a small font to engage their intellectual brain.
Thanks. Should we take a couple of the questions? Because we have 5 minutes left.
I was reading Katerina's question for Joaquín. She says, this is so fast. Oh, okay, great. You can put it on screen. I think this is for you, Joaquín.
Okay, so that's a very interesting question, and this is ongoing research. Actually, we don't. I mean, we know that these participants in the center need to be symmetrically positioned from the two sides. We know that they have to be confident about their views. But we are still working on trying to understand what are the kind of like personality characteristics associated with this kind of people, of participants in our research. So one hypothesis that I have is that they need to score high in a trait called intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is the ability to recognize that your own thoughts, ideas, and even values can eventually be wrong. It's not that you tend to endorse wrong ideas, but you tend to basically be open to the possibility that your ideas could eventually be wrong. So that's a key characteristic to engaging with people who think differently, and we believe that these people who are moderators but see both kinds of sides may also be intellectually humble.
Intellectual humility. I think we are going to keep that phrase for all of us today. No, it's great.
So can I take one question from the chat? There's a very interesting question by Enrique Mendizábal who asked where symmetrically positioned, asked me to elaborate on the symmetrically positioned meaning. And by symmetrically positioned, I don't necessarily mean in the center, because our result would be quite dull if we would have just say, okay, people when deliberate, they kind of go to the center, to a point of indecision, and that's not how these moderators work. They tend to be they could take sides but not go to extremes. So that's the kind of like the definition of these moderators, and these moderators essentially are informative about binary decisions, say going to the left or the right, or going to accept or not accept, and so on.
Right. This has been a really interesting conversation. I hope we can continue discussing this. It's been really enriching, but it's time to close. And I don't know if you want to have any final words, Sonia and Joaquin.
I would just say that I love the fact that Kike said that this keeps him thinking hard. I think that's the idea of, and something that all of us enjoy a lot, thinking hard. So and that's the impression I have from reading on experimental psychology and neuroscience, that it makes me think hard about the way we produce knowledge, we work collectively, and we communicate knowledge. So I invite you all to start paying attention to this area of research, because I think it's absolutely rewarding for people working on think tanks or any other knowledge production practice. And thank you very much for having me here. I have enjoyed very much this conversation.
Yeah, same here. I enjoyed it very much. It's very rewarding to not feel disconnected or in academic island and trying to connect my own research with reality, with real problems that think tanks face. And it's been, I think, honestly, a very intellectually humble conversation between all of us today. So thank you very much for the invitation, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Thank you very much, Joaquin. This has been really interesting.